The debate over violent video games can be traced back to the 1976 release of the game Death Race. The object of the game was to run over screaming gremlins with a car, at which point they would turn into tombstones. Controversy erupted because the gremlins resembled stick-figure humans, and it was reported that the working title of the game was Pedestrian. After protesters dragged Death Race machines out of arcades and burned them in parking lots, production of the game ceased. In 2012, reports the Sandy Hook elementary school shooter Adam Lanza was deeply immersed in violent video games has prompted questions about whether gamesmanship instilled in him the will and the skill to commit mass murder. The Newton, Connecticut killings followed a handful of others, all of which included shooters with correlative behaviors, including allegedly playing violent video games. These events have sparked a public outcry to censor violent and realistic video games for the country. But has anyone stopped to consider the mental health, accessibility to firearms, or parental influence of these killers? The media, and more importantly the government, turn to blame on an easy scapegoat shrouded in controversy: the video games. Much like movies and television filled with graphic content, explicit violence, sexuality, and inappropriate language, video games can have all those same elements combined with user interactivity. Games can provide an outlet for aggression that doesn't exist otherwise, and many gamers appreciate that fact. They have a safe, non-physical release for frustrations that they might otherwise have taken out on themselves or others in a potentially harmful way. It is not surprising that most schoolyard shooters and many adult mass murderers had played violent video games in their spare time. Violent people are often attracted to violent entertainment in general, not just video games. There is no evidence supporting the relationship between video games and real-world violence. Since 1985, when the Nintendo Entertainment System was launched in the US, sales of video games, the amount of violence in them, and the realism of that violence has all gone up. But youth violence has not. There has been a cyclical increase in youth violence since 1970, well before video games became common. But it peaked in 1994, just after the very first truly violent games such as Mortal Kombat were released, but before they became popular. According to the New York Times, between 1994 and 2010, the number of violent crimes among youth offenders fell by more than half, to 224 crimes per population of 100,000. At the same time, sales of video games have more than doubled since 1996. The ESRB was established in 1994 by the Entertainment Software Association in response to criticism of violent content found in video games such as Mortal Kombat and Doom, which is reportedly the game the Columbine killers were obsessed with, and other controversial video games portraying excessively violent or intense sexual situations. Despite the ESRB ratings being voluntary, many retail stores prohibit the sale of unrated video games, and major console manufacturers will not license games for their systems unless they carry ESRB ratings. The largest study on video games conducted by the Department of Justice concluded the vast majority of kids who played mature-rated games, which is the equivalent of an R rating for movies, did not engage in any, quote, problem behaviors, and that boys who played no video games whatsoever had a greater risk of getting into fights than all boys who played video games, even violent ones. Now, since there is no real evidence linking violent video games and violent crimes, there is left nothing but speculation as to what drives someone to take the lives of classmates, strangers, or young children. I personally believe it's a product of many things, like mental instability, or a poor home environment, or the combination of those, which may contribute to such violent acts. However, I am in no way saying they are solely responsible. I do, however, believe parents need to take more responsibility for their children's violent game exposure. Although virtual violence is not linked to real-world violence, I think children need to be mentally prepared to witness a lot of the blood, gore, and sexual acts that are depicted in movies, television, and video games. Why would you want to expose your child to such images when they still retain much of their innocence about life? Let them have their childhood. I personally would not allow my child to play a graphically violent video game before I thought my child was mentally able to handle that imagery. Because I've played those games, I know they're violent, they're bloody, and they contain vulgar language and actions inappropriate for certain audiences. Parents need to know what they are buying their kids. Don't just take your kid's word for it. Be knowledgeable, do research if you have to, and most importantly, listen to your child and be involved in their lives. I also believe that parents need to show some responsibility if they have guns in the home. I am not a member of the NRA, nor am I anti-gun by any means. I keep a gun for home defense, but I also have a child, and I have taken the necessary steps to prevent that child from ever gaining access to the weapon. Parents of children who are mentally ill or mentally unstable, or suspect that, should use sincere caution when having weapons in the home. I think the same logic needs to be applied to their exposure to violence in movies and video games. Certain games should be age appropriate until that person can differentiate that video games are not simulations of reality. They are just merely electronic entertainment. To quote Dennis Semeka from his article, "I'm mentally ill, I love violent video games, and they've never made me feel like killing anyone." He says, if we want to look at why Adam Lanza walked into an elementary school and opened fire on a bunch of children and adults, it's not video games we need to be looking at. We need to ask who was paying attention to him, and had anyone noticed something was wrong with him emotionally? We need to ask whether there are common sense rules about firearm ownership that ought to be more strictly mandated by law. Why were the ammunition magazines of the Bushmaster assault rifle Lanza used out in the open versus being locked away in a safe? Why didn't all those weapons have trigger guards on them? I think, in the end, there are a lot of things that are responsible for mass shootings and public violence, but I don't believe video games are one of them.